we're good to go. So welcome again. Thank you all for coming. My name is Will Smith. I'm a technical solutions consultant with Intellias. With me is my colleague, Eric Miller. He's another technical solutions consultant. Today, we're going to be talking to you all about the file creation utility. This is kind of a powerful and still fairly new tool that's delivered with Infor HR Talent that Eric and I have used out in the field with a number of clients, and we've found it to be very powerful and very useful. And so we wanted to go ahead and share some of that knowledge with you all today. So before we get into it, I do want to talk a little bit about us, about Intellias. So we are a software and consulting services company. We're headquartered in Dallas, Texas, but we also have an office in Chicago and consultants and team members all over the country. We were established all the way back in 1999, and we've been an Infor Alliance partner for quite a while. So we work primarily with Infor, and we're familiar with many of their offerings. We work with a number of Infor clients, and then we have our own software offerings to kind of extend and enhance the delivered Infor functionality. We also provide consulting services, so anything from loss and technical services to helping with upgrades, cloud services, application consulting, really anything you can think of in terms of a need in the Infor loss world. There's somebody on the Intellias team who would be equipped to help out with that. So if that's something any of you have any interest in, always feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Eric, or reach out to another member of our team. And we will have some contact information at the end of this presentation if that's something you all are interested in, or if you have follow-up questions from the presentation today for Eric and I. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. So here's our agenda for today. We'll be talking about what is the file creation utility, what is the FCU. We'll talk about some of the advantages of this tool and how the file creation utility works. We'll go through some hands-on examples of kind of what Eric and I have seen out in the field, so similar to things that we've implemented with various clients. Then we'll take a look at extending the functionality of the FCU using tools like ION or IPA. And then we'll talk about migrating FCU setups from one environment into another. And then we'll save some time for questions at the end as well. So what is the file creation utility? Well, the FCU is basically a delivered tool with Infor HR Talent. By the way, when I say Infor HR Talent, some of you may be more familiar with the term Infor CloudSuite HCM. When I say Infor HR Talent, I'm talking about the same product there. This is just a newer naming convention, but I know that's a pretty recent change. So Infor HR Talent, CloudSuite HCM are synonymous when you hear us refer to HR Talent. But anyway, so the FCU is a delivered utility that does require version 11.0.7 or newer. But if you're on that version or higher, you have the FCU kind of packaged and ready to go, delivered with your product. So basically what the FCU does is it allows for the creation of files based on mappings of data in the system. So basically you're able to, as long as you know where data is in the system, you're able to use the FCU to pull that out and write it to a flat file very quickly and easily without the need for technical knowledge, without needing to know how to write code or needing to know IPA very well or anything like that. As long as you know what data you need and what format it needs to be in, you can basically use this tool with a slight learning curve to very quickly and easily start creating flat files. And what Eric and I have found with a number of our clients is that these flat files can be very, very useful in integrations and interfaces to various vendors. So one thing that we've seen a lot out in the field are, maybe you have benefits vendors who need certain demographic information sent to them in a certain format, every month or every week or whatever it may be. So this tool can be very, very useful for kind of quickly and easily creating flat files to handle a need like that. So let's talk about some of the advantages of the FCU. Oh, did somebody have a question? Maybe just unmuted by accident. Okay. So let's talk about some of the advantages of the FCU. So basically, files can be created either from all existing records that meet FCU criteria, or you create files from only records that have been changed, only deltas since the last file creation date. So that can be very useful to help reduce your processing time and processing load on generating files like this, especially if you only need deltas or only need changes since the last file runtime. There's an easy toggle in the system. It's just a little checkbox, right, delivered right with the FCU, where you can toggle that on and off without the need to kind of build out complicated logic to handle something like that. Another major advantage of this tool is that you can basically link process flows to process this file automatically once it's been created. So you can send it directly out of the FCU into IPA or ION. If you need some sort of post-processing using some more complicated logic, you can very easily do that with the FCU. And then a third major advantage, and this is one that I already touched on a little bit, but basically this allows flat file interfaces to become extremely quick and easy to build. You don't really need any technical knowledge to use this tool. Again, there will be a little bit of a learning curve as you get used to it, but really if you use the system and you understand the system, and again, if you know kind of where to find data and what data you need and what format you need it in, you can certainly use this tool to build interfaces without needing to code or anything like that. And then these interfaces also are, because of that reason, they become much easier to maintain sorry, let me check the chat real quick. I see. Okay, sorry, just answering a question. I wondered if that was something for me, but it was not. But anyway, these interfaces become, very easy to maintain. So even if you bring in, a more technical resource or an outside consulting company or something like that to build out an interface, then maybe somebody a little bit less technical would be able to understand and make changes to the interface and maintain it and things like that. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but using either Infor Spreadsheet Designer or the delivered FCU import and export tool, these FCU setups are very, very easy to maintain and import and export and move between various environments. So those are kind of three key advantages. So next, let's talk about how the FCU works. So to navigate to the FCU, you'll want to log into HR Talent and switch to the Integration Architect role. And then from there, you'll navigate to File Creation Utility and then Dashboard. And you can see once we've clicked Dashboard here in this screenshot, you get a list of all your existing FCU setups. So you could double click into a record and see the details about that setup, the rows and the columns and all of that. You could generate files from there and do all sorts of actions on the particular FCU setup. You can also create a new one from this dashboard. And you can obviously view everything that already exists. So this is kind of the main stop for accessing all of your FCU setups. And again, that's Integration Architect, File Creation Utility, Dashboard. So then once you're there and you've created a setup, you of course need to know the components that go into building out an FCU. So there are four kind of main pieces of an FCU setup. We have eligibility groups, rows, columns, and data mappings. So we're going to talk through each of these four components in a little bit more detail. So first, eligibility groups. Now, maybe some of you all are already familiar with eligibility groups, also sometimes known as business class groups, but these are basically groups that can be set up in the system, and then you can define conditions for a group. So I think a good kind of simple example would be an eligibility group on the employee business class. And maybe your condition is active, right? So you're saying that to be a member of that eligibility group, you must be an active employee. So then say we defined a group like that, we could then attach that to an FCU setup. And then if we were, for example, wanting to pull a flat file that had demographic information for all active employees, we would use our eligibility group, and it would basically iterate through all employees and use that eligibility group criteria to only select the active employees. And of course, you can get much more complicated with your eligibility group criteria and conditions if you have a need for that, but that's just kind of a simple example of how you can define these groups attach them to an FCU setup, and then use that group or that eligibility condition from the group to kind of limit the number of records or limit the processing of your FCU output to the final flat file. A couple things to consider when defining these eligibility groups for the FCU. So eligibility groups are defined for a specific business class. So you want to make sure that that will mesh with the business class that you have defined to your FCU setup. And then another thing to be cognizant of is that when you are creating an eligibility group to use with the FCU, you will need to attach a business subject to that group. Otherwise, you won't see the eligibility group as an option to attach to your FCU in the FCU setup. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So you can see here, I've got an eligibility group that was created for use with an FCU. You can see in my condition, I'm essentially saying that the termination date must be within the last year or they're not terminated. And then we've got a custom group subject, and this group subject is really what allows us to attach this eligibility group to the FCU. So for all of these subjects, they're always going to start with this prefix right here that says HCM group file creation, but then this last piece is going to be different for different group subjects. So in this case, you can see on my FCU setup, my source file is employee. So that's going to be the final piece of my group subject here. It's going to be HCM group file creation employee. Now, if my source file for the FCU that I wanted to attach this group to was different, let's say this source file was work assignment or some other business class, then my subject would read HCM group file creation work assignment, for example. And then once you've attached these group subjects, you'll be able to attach the eligibility group to the FCU within the FCU setup and see the condition limit the row processing, like I talked about. So the next component of the FCU are the rows. These are basically exactly what they sound like. So the kind of the rows that will come through in your final output file, right? So again, if we're using the example of an employee demographic file, basically, each employee might be a row. So we might have a employee row in our FCU setup. Maybe it's got processing conditions on it. And then in our final file, we'll see a number of rows created for all the employees that met our processing criteria. So these are kind of the next step. Once you've created the initial setup or the initial definition of your FCU, the next step will be to go ahead and create your rows. And there's no limit on the number of rows that you can create, so you can go a little crazy with this if you want to, and have unlimited rows. Another thing that you can do is you can define rows as either header or trailer rows. We'll look at how to do that in a second, but basically, if you want a row to only appear in the file once, you'll define it as a header or a trailer. Obviously, a header row will appear at the top of the file. A trailer row will appear as the last row in a file. And those rows will only appear once. So as kind of a visual example, if you had, again, that employee demographic file, maybe you would have 3 rows in your FCU setup, a header row, an employee row, and a trailer row. And then your final file would have your header row, maybe 100 employee rows, and then your trailer row. And then another thing to note is that you can actually define row processing conditions for each row. So as kind of an alternative to the eligibility group conditions that are being applied to the entire FCU, to every single row that's being processed, you can define row processing conditions, and those will only affect that specific row. So for example, if you have a file where you're pulling both an employee row and a dependent row, you could have different row processing conditions for employees and dependents. So here's an example of what a row kind of setup may look like. You'll notice the 3 tabs at the top. We've got detail, conditions, and one-to-many. So we'll talk through each tab. On the detail tab, you define the description of your row, which is basically the name of the row. Here you can see our description is dependents. And so again, kind of going back to my example, this screenshot is pulled from a benefits interface to a dental vendor, where basically they're pulling, each employee who's enrolled in this specific dental plan and then all of their dependents. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment, but that's where this dependence description comes from. Then you've got your row order. This will be auto-assigned, or you can assign it manually if you want to change the row order around. You've got your row type. So if I was doing kind of a more, normal row, if you will, I might say a source file row type. And then, in the same file, there's another row that's an employee row. So that would look something like source file, and then it would have a source business class of employee, and it would pull, all employees. In this case, we've got a one-to-many row, and we're pulling dependents. So the dependents for each employee. And then you can also define header and trailer rows here. So those are what we talked about, where you can have a header row appear only once at the top of your file, or a trailer row only once at the end of your file. You can also link rows to other FCU setups or link them to other rows as well. Next, on the conditions tab, these are the row processing conditions that we talked about. So you can see here we've got a condition where we're saying termination date must not be entered. So the employee that this dependent is related to must still be active, must not have been terminated for the dependent row to go ahead and process and come through into our final file. And then finally, let's talk a little bit more about one-to-many rows. So I kind of alluded to this, but just to help visualize it a little bit more, again, this is from a demographic info file that's going to a dental vendor, where we're pulling employees who are enrolled in this plan, as well as their dependents, and the dependent is kind of a one-to-many relationship to employee. So in the final file, you might see something like, an employee row, and then two dependents, 2 rows after that, and then, another employee row, and maybe 4 dependent rows for that employee, and then another employee row who maybe doesn't have any dependents. So it really depends on the employee and how many dependents they have, but that's kind of what a one-to-many relationship would look like in the FCU, where you're pulling, many dependents for each one employee. And over on the one-to-many tab here, another thing to note is that I also have a data selection condition defined in this tab. You can see I'm saying that our dependent has dental must equal true. This is basically a user-defined field that I'm using to determine whether the dependent is eligible for this particular dental plan or not. And we're saying, yes, they must, this must be equal to true, so they must have this dental plan. And if that's the case, they'll go ahead and get pulled into that final interface file that we're sending over. If they're not enrolled in this plan, well, then they'll be excluded from the file because the dental vendor does not need their information. So that's how a one-to-many row would work. So the next component that we'll talk about for the FCU are the columns. Similar to rows, these are basically exactly what they sound like. They're the columns to the row, right? So they're basically the fields within a specific row. So going back yet again to the same example I keep using of the employee information. If you've got employee rows, some of your columns or your fields might be things like employee first name, employee last name, address, social security number, date of birth. Things like that would be these FCU columns or fields, basically. And you can start creating these columns as soon as you have created rows. So you'll basically click into a row within the FCU setup and then create columns for each row. Once you start creating columns, you have a few options for the column types. You can create literals. So if you want to hard code a literal string or literal value, you can do that. You can also pull any business class fields or user fields. So anything, any system delivered data or anything that's user defined, you can pull out into these columns. And then you can also pull blank fields if you just need some spacing as well in your file. And then finally on these columns, you can use regular expressions and substring functions to format them right within the FCU processing. So basically without the need for any post-processing with IPA or anything like that, you can go ahead and format these columns as they come out of the system using regular expressions or substrings. So here's a quick example of what the column detail setup would look like. So we can see we've got our column order here. So this will be the 13th field in a row. And the field name is a relationship code. You can include a description and comments if you want to. And then you define the data type. Here we've got alpha because we're using alphanumeric characters for our field that we're pulling. Then you can define the option, so whether the field is optional or required or blank, you define right here. And then you use this toggle to say, is this field, on a one-to-many business class, or is this field on our main source business class or source file? If it was, then you would select a business class here and then select a field. Alternatively, you can see this is a one-to-many field, so it's getting pulled from the dependent business class. We're pulling the dependent relationship to the employee. So we've got this checked to one-to-many, and then we pull our relationship source field down here. And then let's move on to the final FCU component, the data mappings. So these are basically used to remap values that come out of the system to their expected states. So if you have something that's coming out of the system that is kind of the data you need, but not in the format you need, if you will, that's where data mappings can become very, very useful. So an example down here, we've got, like you can see, the dental vendor needs to see the relationship code as a numeric value, right? They need to see a 02 or a 03 or a 01, et cetera. They need to see a number to determine the relationship status. But in the system, we have these values stored as things like spouse or domestic partner. So basically, we're using this data mapping table to change, if the field gets pulled out of the system as spouse, we're remapping that to be written to the file as 02. Same thing with domestic partner. Another thing to note is that the default mapping will be selected if there's no match. So if we pulled out a relationship value of like sister, for example, based on this mapping table, that would map to 03 because this is the default mapping and sister does not match one of these other values here. So that's something to be aware of. That can be really helpful. It can also get you into trouble. So just know that if there's no match found, your default mapping will be mapped to the file. So again, this is just very, very useful in scenarios where your data is stored in the system as numbers or state values or something, but those state values are not exactly what the dental vendor or what the vendor needs to see. So it's kind of an easy way to translate data quickly as it's getting pulled out of the system before it's ever even written to the file, again, without the need for any post-processing at all. So now let's talk about how to generate the FCU file. So once you've gotten through all your setup, defined your rows, defined your columns, and all your conditions and all of that, you're going to need to obviously go ahead and generate your files. Now, one thing to note is that you do need records or preview records to go ahead and generate these files. So if you click Generate File before you've ever generated any preview records, you'll get a lack of result or a blank file. So you do want to make sure you always generate preview records first. And then once you've done that, you can go ahead and generate a file, or you can generate a file threaded, and we'll talk about the difference between those two in just a moment here. But again, just clicking into a setup and clicking one of these options will go ahead and generate a file. So let's go ahead and talk about the threaded file generation. So basically, you can use the generate file threaded action to allow this file to run on multiple async threads simultaneously. So basically allowing for quicker processing of these FCU files. One thing to note is that this does, in theory, have the potential to slow down your processing for other items because of the fact that every environment has a limit of the total number of async threads that can be running at once. So you could run into issues there, just something to kind of be aware of. Typically, in my experience, I've seen that these FCU files process quickly enough that this doesn't tend to really be an issue. So I think that the generate file threaded action is very handy to kind of help speed up processing. And again, to do that, you'll just click on the generate file threaded action and then select your threading method. So however many threads you want to use, and go ahead and submit that. And then your file generation will run on multiple threads concurrently. And then one last thing to talk about with the file generation is that you also have the ability to schedule these FCU files to generate on a regular basis. So if you have a file that needs to go out to a vendor, once a week or once a month or whatever it may be, you have the ability to do that. Basically, what you'll do is you'll click the Generate Preview Records action. So this action over here on the left. So you'll click that, and that will basically pull up this little form here. And as long as you click this checkbox that says Generate File after creating preview records, you can then click the scheduler and use this delivered scheduler to go ahead and set a recurring schedule for your file generation. Many of you are probably already familiar with the scheduler. You may have seen it for IPA flows or scheduled actions or something like that. But yeah, you can use this in tandem with a Generate Preview Records action to basically go ahead and schedule your files to run on a recurring basis. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Eric, and he's going to walk us through some hands-on FCU examples, and then talk through a little bit more information at the end.
All right, thanks, Will. So now that Will has kind of walked us through the basics of these file creation utilities, the four main components, we wanted to give some more real-life examples of these file creation utilities. So we can access these file creation utilities by going to Integration Architect, File Creation Utility, and then Dashboard. And from here, we can see all the file creation utilities that have been set up in your environment. If you need to create a new one, you can simply click the Create New button up here, or to see information about an existing one, we can go ahead and double click on it to open up the setup. So when we open up the setup, the first tab that we see is this Delta Dental setup. We can see that this is active with a source file of employees. If we open up this dropdown, we can see all the different source files that can be used within the file creation utility. It is not every single business class, but a majority of the business classes are listed here. And I found that as Infor HR Talent continues to get upgraded, we'll see more and more source files added as possibilities within the file creation utility. On this screen, we can also define the file name, and we can also very easily append a timestamp to the file name if that's something that's needed by the vendor or whoever really is ingesting this file. On the File Attributes and Processing tab, we can see all the different attributes of this specific file creation setup. The first one is the file type. The file type can either be a separated, kind of like a CSV, or a fixed length file. In this case, we have a fixed length file setup. On the processing section, we can see the other different attributes that we can define, one of them being the file segment limit. So we can limit these files to be a certain number of records or megabytes if needed. We can also define the generation behavior for no output. If there were no records pulled in, do we want to generate no file record? Do we want to generate a file record with no document? Or do we want to generate a file record with a document? On the setup, we can also define the threading method. So the default threading method, if this is generated via the generate file threaded action, we can create individual files per thread or merge files per thread if needed. Individual would create, maybe 3 files if it uses 3 threads. Merged would create the 3 of them and then merge them together at the end. We can also see the flow that is going to be used to process this file. So this can be used to perform various post-processing and things like that. And we can also automatically send the file to ION to be worked with within ION Desk. On the Record Selection Options tab, we can see where the eligibility group for this specific file creation utility is defined, as well as if we want to include all records or Delta records. If we turn this flag off, it'll only include the records that have been changed since the last file generation. We turn it on. It will always include every record that's pulled into the file creation utility. So we can very easily create these different types of files as needed by your organization. On the Mappings tab, we can see where a lot of the meat of the file creation utility is defined. This is really controlling the rows and columns that are listed in each row within the file creation utility. So if we take a look at these two rows up here, we have a source file row that uses the employee business class, and we have a one-to-many row that uses the dependent business class. So the one-to-many row, in this case, would basically, for each employee, it would list all of the dependents for that employee, whether it be no dependents or if it's 5 dependents. The file creation utility is smart enough to basically automatically use that one-to-many relation between those two business classes to pull in the associated records. If we click into one of these rows, we can see all of the different columns that can be defined for that specific row. They can be literals, they can be fields like these business class fields, or blank if necessary to kind of build in those kind of space delimited files if that's something that your organization needs. And we go ahead and double click on one of those, we can see some more information about this specific column setup. So this is the relationship code field. We can include comments. So we can make sure to list, any necessary information about this specific column. So if other people are taking a look at our file creation utility setup, they can very easily figure out, okay, what is this column doing? What kind of information does it contain? And things like that. We can set the data type, which you can see there are numerous different data types that can be selected, as well as the field if it's optional, required, a literal, or a blank. Down here in the source value section, we can see if the field is on a one-to-many business class. If it's not, we can select the source business class. The source business class here will list all the different kind of associated business classes that can be used to pull in these different columns. So we can see all the different ones here. And I do want to call out that the source business classes available within the column setup changes depending on what source file you're using within your FCU. So just some things to keep in mind as you work with these is that, the data that you can pull in really changes depending on the source file that you're going to use. We can see the field that's being pulled in. In this case, it's the relationship field that goes ahead and pulls in the relationship for this specific dependent. On the formatting tab, we can, specify a Java format or a regular expression, as well as different substring values if we need to pull only a specific substring of the data. Finally, on the data mapping tab is where we can do this kind of mapping from value to value. In this case, this specific column does not have a data mapping set up. But this is where that information would live if the data in the field needs to be mapped. So now that we've kind of poked around the file creation utility, I want to run through, how these files are created. On the preview records tab is where we can see the preview records, and these preview records are what are used to actually go ahead and generate the file. So the generate preview records action will go ahead and populate the preview records. It'll basically pull in every single row or record from the source file business class that meets our eligibility group criteria. When we generate the preview records, typically I'll just like to generate the file right after to automatically kick off the generate file action once the preview records have finished generating. So So we'll go ahead and select Generate File after creating preview records and click Submit. If we give this a second here and refresh, we should see our preview records begin to be populated with all of those records that meet the criteria of our eligibility group. So if we continue to refresh, we should start seeing these. You'll notice the key will change, but we'll start seeing these preview records being pulled out of the list and dumped into our file creation utility file that is generated. So as we continue to refresh, we'll continue to see these dumped into our file. And you may be wondering, where are these files generated? These files will be generated on the Files tab of the File Creation Utility Setup. Here we can see our file that was most recently generated. We know it has not completed generation yet because the size in megabytes is blank and the file name is blank. Once the file has been created, it will populate these two fields with the correct value. These files are not actually created on your server due to the fact that, if you're a multi-tenant customer, you don't have access to the actual server. So these files that are created are really just blob data within the landmark database. But if we double click on one of these records, we can very easily download these files to be used or, inspected if necessary. So that's a pretty simple overview of, the possibilities of the file creation utility. Where we commonly see our clients use these is to create these flat files that, maybe they just migrated to multi-tenant, right? And they no longer have access to the backend databases, and maybe they were creating these different flat files using SQL abstracts. These file creation utility setups are a very, very good way to remove the need for, those SQL abstracts to be run and can be very convenient in the multi-tenant environment. Really, all you need to know to generate these files is, the fields that you need to pull in the format that it needs to be in. We don't need to know any SQL, any JavaScript, nor IPA to really create these flat files very simply and very easily. The next thing that I want to talk about is how we can even extend the functionality of the file creation utility by using ION or IPA. So within the file creation utility setup, as you saw, we can automatically send these file creation files to either an IPA flow or an ION data flow. These are automatically triggered once the file has been generated, and some common use cases that we'll see from our clients are encrypting the files. If the file needs to be encrypted before it's uploaded to an SFTP server or emailed, whatever it may be, we can very easily do that using ION or IPA. On top of that, we can upload them to an SFTP server. And the benefit of this is it really creates that full-fledged integration solution that requires absolutely zero manual intervention. We can schedule the file creation utility to run on maybe a weekly or a daily basis as needed. We can link the IPA flow or ION data flow to our file creation utility setup, which will automatically take that file and place it where it needs to be. We can also perform any sort of resorting or post-processing of the file using either ION data flows or IPA flows. So this is an example of an ION data flow that we created for use at one of our clients to basically resort the file and upload it to an SFTP server once it's been sorted in the correct format. So within this very simple data flow, we're seeing first we're grabbing the file from the application. Once we grab the file, we go ahead and process it using the Python script seen below. So we can use things like Python to perform any sort of post-processing as needed within that file. In this case, we are resorting the file, to sort it by the employee ID descending to make sure that the newest employees are passed first in the file, oldest employees are passed last in the file. Once that file has been regenerated and resorted, we go ahead and upload it to the SFTP server to read it, to be read from the ingester of this specific file. So this similar concept can be done very easily within IPA as well. In this case, this is another example of an IPA flow that we linked to a file creation utility setup to grab the file, write it to an SFTP server, and then send email confirmation to the person in charge of the file, letting them know, okay, this file has been placed on the SFTP server in this location, to let them know that this file has been created, the integration has been handled. So like I said, the ability of linking these IPA flows or ION data flows can really help create a full-fledged integration solution for your organization, and something that we've seen more and more clients take advantage of, especially when moving to multi-tenant. You may be wondering, how do we go ahead and migrate these FCU setups? How do we have to go into the new environment and manually create the setup? Fortunately, it's much easier than that. So anything built in the FCU, or file creation utility, can be easily backed up, maintained, and migrated using the Infor Spreadsheet Designer. So the 4 business classes that relate to these file creation utility setups are the file creation row detail, column detail, data mapping, and setup. So it's as simple as querying those business classes, pulling down the data, and uploading it to your new environment. So this process is very, very easy. And this way of migration using the Infor Spreadsheet Designer can be done in any environment that the file creation utility is available in. Starting in HR Talent version 11.0.33 and higher, there's an even easier way to do it. Within this version and higher, there's the delivered export setup action, which will take your setup and export it to one single file that can then be downloaded from the application. Once you download that file, we can just take it and upload it into our new environment, and the whole migration process takes 5 minutes at most. So in order to export one of these file creation utility setups, we log into the Integration Architect web app, go to the FCU dropdown and select the dashboard menu item. We would find the setup that we need to export, and we could right-click on it to export that setup. That will create a record on the Mapping Export tab of the file creation setup. So once you open it up, there'll now be a new tab called Mapping Export, where you can go in and download the mapping export that we just created for this specific file. Once we have our file that we've exported our file creation utility to, we would then log into our new environment. Again, go to the Integration Architect web app, go to FCU and the Actions dropdown and select the Import Setup action. And that will bring up this form, which we would just define the organization, the export file, if we want to create or update an existing setup, and the separator and end of line character for our specific FCU. Once we perform this action, that new FCU will be created in the different environment very easily, very quickly, without a bunch of manual recreation of these different FCUs. So with that, we've kind of run through what is the FCU, what are some of the advantages, and when do we see our clients take advantage of these? How does it work? And we really covered some real-world examples to see how the file creation utility can be taken advantage of, how we can extend the functionality and migrate these different FCUs between environments. So that's kind of all we had today. If anyone has any questions, which I believe I've seen a couple come in through the chat in the Q&A, which I'll go ahead and pull up now. All right. So if anyone has any questions that they want to call out, feel free to unmute yourself and let us know what questions you have. Otherwise, we can start running through the questions that we see in the Q&A. All right, so it looks like no one has any questions immediately.
Chandra from Intellias. Yeah, hey. We do have a few in the Q&A section for you. One of them, and this came earlier in the session, is the data pulled from the data lake or directly from AWS?
So that's a great question, and another one of the huge benefits of the FCU. These file creation utilities are created using real-time application data. It's not pulling any information from the data lake that needs to be refreshed, and there's a chance it may be out of date. So the difference kind of between using Compass versus the file creation setup is that this is going to be 100% real-time data from the time that file was generated.
All right, and the next question, can a BU be an audit?
Like, can one of the source files be one of the audit files within the application? I'm a bit confused by that one.
That was my question. This is Keith. I meant to type in, can a BC or business class be an audit?
That's what I thought.
So employee audit, dependent audit, I didn't see any of the audit business classes when I was looking on my own system.
Got it. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're limited to kind of what's available within the source file section. So if that employee audit or dependent audit source files are not available, unfortunately, we could not create a file creation utility for that business class.
Thank you.
This was another one from you, Keith. Can this be called from an IPA or file channel?
I would say in theory, within IPA, if we needed to call the generation of a file, that's something that is possible, although I don't see immediately a bunch of use cases where that would be relevant. Keith, what is a situation where you would like to, trigger the generation of this file from a file channel?
Since we've been using Compass for a while, we know how slow it is, and some of the processes to walk through these rep sets. So if this is faster, if we can actually have the file being generated then within our IPA, we can say, hey, generate this file, go to the next step. When it's done, I can reuse it within my IPA, or I can send it off someplace, or I can further do some more processing with it.
Definitely, yes. We could trigger the generation of these files within IPA. I believe it would just be going to the file creation setup business class and performing the generate preview records action, then immediately following that, performing the generate file action.
Okay.
Right, we've got another one. Can complex logic, like what we'd use in the where clause in SQL, be done using this tool?
Yes, there's a couple of different ways that we can limit the records that are pulled in. So in terms of record selection, we can use these eligibility groups, which if you haven't worked with them before, they can be as simple or as complex as needed. And these will limit the number of records that are pulled in to the file creation utility and are created as preview records. On top of that, as Will mentioned, we can have these row processing conditions. We can have up to 2, where we can, do some sort of comparison of the data, make sure it's entered or not entered, and things like that, to limit the number of records that are pulled in. And the nice part about these is we don't have to manually create the links between these business classes that are used within the file creation utility. It's smart enough to take advantage of the application delivered relations and pull in the necessary files or fields as needed.
All right, and then I think we've got just one more. If we've missed any of your questions, please, as Eric said, chime in, unmute yourself. But the last one I see here is, what's the difference between FCU and replication sets?
Got it, yes. So that's a common question that we'll get. Replication sets are going to replicate that data into, whether it be a directory or using Infor messaging services to send it to your data lake. File creation utility is actually going to create these separated or fixed length files in that sort of format. So yes, we can use replication sets to dump data into the Infor data lake and generate flat files and things like that way. But the one drawback of that we've seen for our clients is it's not real-time application data that we're querying out of Compass. It's only is relevant as the last time the replication set was run. So if you're running it, every hour, that may be a situation that may work for you. If you aren't running it as often as that, sometimes you'll get out-of-date data within your ION or Infor Compass queries and things like that. I see a couple more coming in the chat. We do not manually do these joins within the file creation utility. Really, we take advantage of the application delivered relations, and we can use them to pull in additional data. Like in this case, we're taking advantage of the employee to dependent relation to pull in all the related dependents for the employees that are pulled into our file. So we're not manually making these joins, but the file creation utility is smart enough to kind of take advantage of those delivered joins, as we'll call them, within the application. The next one that I'm seeing is in the FCU, when adding a column with source value, should something show up when selecting the search in source field? So if we go ahead and take a look at this and we go to add a new column for our employee row, we can, we'll just type in test, alpha, optional, and here we can select the different source business classes. So for example, if we wanted to pull in something from work assignment, we can open up the source fields and pick them here. We've found that this dropdown can be a little funky within the field selector. So one thing that we'll always recommend is, rather than going in and using the field picker, if you know the name of the field and the business class it's on, you can select the source business class and just type in the source field. A lot of times that field selector is pretty finicky to work with, so we always recommend to kind of just type it in manually when you know the source business class and field necessary. All right, so it looks like that's the end of the question. So I do want to say thank you for everyone for attending, giving us some of your time to give you a little bit more information about the file creation utility. Again, I'm Eric Miller. Will Smith, my colleague, was who presented in the first half. If you guys have any questions at all about the file creation utility, feel free to reach out. As Chandra said, the slide deck will be sent out, and the recording of this will be on our website if you ever need to refer back to it. But yeah, any questions ever, we're more than happy to help.